Imagine a fortress that has never been conquered. An island city rising from the sea, protected by walls 150 feet tall, defended by the most skilled sailors in the ancient world. For centuries, empires have crashed against these walls like waves against stone, and for centuries Tyre has stood unbreakable. Now picture a young conqueror, fresh from shattering a Persian army, standing on a beach and staring at this impossible island. His engineers tell him it cannot be taken. His generals beg him to bypass it. The defenders laugh at him from their impregnable walls. But Alexander the Great doesn't see an obstacle. He sees destiny. What happens next is so audacious, so impossible, that it defies belief. Welcome to the Siege of Tyre, where one man decided to wage war against the ocean itself, and where the impossible became history's greatest engineering marvel. Before we dive into this incredible 7-month epic of engineering genius and brutal determination, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This is a story of innovation, desperation, and the sheer force of human will that you absolutely won't want to miss. Now, let's witness how Alexander the Great accomplished what no conqueror in history had ever achieved. The year was 332 BC, and Alexander the Great was riding an unstoppable wave of conquest that seemed divinely ordained. Just months earlier, in November of 333 BC, he had shattered a massive Persian army at the Battle of Issus, sending King Darius III fleeing in terror and abandoning his own family on the battlefield. The victory was so complete, so psychologically devastating, that it seemed the entire Persian Empire was crumbling before him like sand. But Alexander understood something that lesser commanders might have missed. He knew that an empire isn't truly defeated until you control not just its armies, but its lifeblood, its trade routes, its ports, and most importantly its ability to strike back. After Issus, instead of charging directly into the heart of Persia, as his impetuous nature might have suggested, Alexander made a calculated, strategic decision that revealed the methodical military genius beneath his legendary audacity. He turned south, marching his army down the Mediterranean coast toward Egypt. His reasoning was coldly pragmatic and brilliant in its strategic foresight. The Persian Empire still commanded a massive fleet, hundreds of warships manned by the Phoenician city-states that had served Persian interests for generations. As long as this fleet existed, it could threaten Alexander's increasingly long and vulnerable supply lines stretching back to Macedonia. It could ferry Persian armies to Greece itself, threatening his homeland and forcing him to abandon his conquest. Alexander's naval forces were insufficient to challenge this armada directly. Many of his Greek allies were naval powers, but he doubted their loyalty and feared they might defect if the winds of fortune shifted. So he devised a strategy of such elegant simplicity it seemed obvious in hindsight. He would conquer the sea by conquering the land. He would capture every single port, every naval base, every harbour along the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, making it physically impossible for the Persian fleet to resupply, to repair, or to operate. The campaign began with stunning success that must have seemed like a triumphal procession. City after city along the Phoenician coast opened their gates to him without resistance. The Phoenicians had never been enthusiastic Persian subjects. They resented the tribute, the interference in their commerce, and the forced conscription of their precious ships and sailors for Persian wars that brought them no benefit. They saw Alexander not as a conqueror, but as an opportunity, a chance to break free from Persian domination while maintaining their profitable trade monopolies. Sidon, one of the great maritime powers, welcomed him with open arms and feasts. Byblos threw open its gates. Aratus sent ambassadors pledging loyalty. It seemed that the entire coast would fall into his lap without a single drop of Macedonian blood being spilled. But then Alexander reached Tyre, and everything changed. Tyre was no ordinary city. It was a legend, a maritime superpower that had dominated Mediterranean trade for over 1,000 years. Founded by the ancient Phoenicians, Tyre had grown fabulously wealthy through its monopoly on purple dye, a colour so rare and expensive it became the symbol of royalty throughout the ancient world. Tyrian ships had sailed to the ends of the known earth, establishing colonies and trading posts from North Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, including the mighty Carthage, which would one day challenge Rome itself. But Tyre's greatest asset, the source of its power and its legendary invincibility, was not its wealth or its ships, it was geography. The main city of Tyre sat on an island fortress approximately half a mile offshore, separated from the mainland by a channel of open water. The island was about 3 miles in circumference, a compact urban fortress with 2 magnificent harbours, one facing north toward Sidon, the other south toward Egypt. The city's walls, constructed of massive blocks of stone, rose a staggering 150 feet into the air, proportionately thick and bristling with defensive towers. No siege ladder in the world could reach such heights. No battering ram could approach across open water. For centuries this island had been considered utterly impregnable, and history had proven that belief justified. The great Assyrian king Shalmaneser III had besieged Tyre for 5 years and failed. The mighty Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar III had laid siege for 13 years, from 586 to 573 BC, and had been forced to withdraw with nothing but the capture of the largely worthless mainland suburb to show for over a decade of effort. The city had never fallen to a siege. The Tyrians knew their history, and they were supremely, perhaps fatally, confident. When Alexander's ambassadors arrived at the city gates in January of 332 BC, they came not with threats but with a seemingly reasonable diplomatic request. Alexander wished to enter the city peacefully and offer sacrifice to Heracles at the temple dedicated to the Phoenician god Melkart, whom the Greeks identified with their own hero god. It seemed a modest, even pious request from a young king who'd shown himself capable of both mercy and diplomacy. But the Tyrians were not fools. They understood the game. They knew that if they opened their gates and allowed Alexander and his army inside, even for a religious ceremony, they would never be their own masters again. They would become just another subject city in Alexander's growing empire. After much debate in their council chambers, they sent back a response that was both diplomatic and defiant. They declared themselves neutral in the war between Alexander and Persia. They would trade with both sides but fight for neither. Alexander was welcome to sacrifice to Melkart, but at the old temple on the mainland, not on the island. The city gates would remain closed. Alexander's reaction to this refusal was immediate and volcanic. He had been met with submission and respect from every other city. This rejection, this declaration of neutrality from what he considered a Persian subject city, was an insult he could not tolerate. He understood that if word spread that Tyre had defied him and survived, every other city in the empire would be emboldened to resist. His entire strategy of coastal conquest would unravel. More practically, he could not leave such a powerful naval base in his rear as he marched into Egypt and beyond. The Persian fleet could use Tyre as a secure base to regroup, resupply and launch devastating raids on his supply lines. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, No face-saving diplomatic solution. Tyre would submit or Tyre would burn. When Alexander called his generals together for a council of war, several of the more cautious voices urged him to bypass the city. They argued that Tyre was too strong, that a siege would take too long, that they should leave a screening force and continue the march south. But Alexander would not hear of it. His response has been preserved by the ancient historians, and it reveals the essence of his character. He declared that he would not march into Asia, into the unknown dangers ahead, while a hostile city threatened his rear and mocked his authority. Tyre had to fall. And so, in January of 332 BC, one of the most remarkable and brutal sieges in all of human history began. When Alexander announced his intention to lay siege to the island of Tyre, his council of generals and engineers must have been plunged into a stunned silence. His chief engineer, a brilliant innovator named Diades of Pella, who had served his father Philip and was a master of torsion artillery and siege tower design, must have thought his king had finally taken leave of his senses. The military problem they faced was not merely difficult, it was unprecedented and by all logical military doctrine seemingly insoluble. How do you conduct a siege of an island fortress when you possess no navy capable of challenging the defenders, let alone blockading their harbours? How do you bring the tools of siegecraft, massive timber-framed siege towers weighing many tons, and heavy stone-throwing catapults, across 1/2 mile of open, unpredictable water? How do you even begin to assault walls that rise 15 stories into the air when your starting point is sea level under constant enemy fire? Every military manual from the past, every bit of conventional wisdom, every hard-won lesson from history screamed that it was impossible. But Alexander was not a man who listened to conventional wisdom. His genius was in his ability to reframe the impossible as a simple matter of will. If the sea separated him from his enemy, then he would not sail it. He would remove it. He would build a causeway, a massive solid bridge of rock, earth and timber, stretching directly across the channel from the mainland to the island's walls. He would create dry land where the gods had placed water. He would walk to Tyre. The ancient historians, writing with a sense of awe that is still palpable today, describe this causeway, which they called a mole, in terms that continue to astonish modern engineers. The scale of the project was almost pharaonic in its ambition. It was to be approximately 200 feet wide, wider than a modern 6-lane highway, broad enough for 2 of Diades' largest siege towers to be rolled out side by side, and it would have to stretch nearly 3,000 feet across the channel to reach the island's formidable southern walls. The construction method was as brutal in its simplicity as it was staggering in its scope. Alexander gave the order for the complete and total demolition of old Tyre, the ancient mainland settlement that had existed for centuries. Every home, every temple, every wall was systematically torn down. The very history of the place was dismantled to pave the way for its future destruction. Legions of his soldiers, supplemented by thousands of conscripted labourers from the surrounding countryside, began the back-breaking, relentless work. They formed human chains, passing stones, rubble, timber from the famed forests of Lebanon, and baskets of earth to the shoreline, where it was all hurled into the sea. Day after day, the sounds of destruction on land and construction in the water echoed across the channel, and Alexander himself, in his characteristic, inimitable style of leadership, was not an absent commander. He spent much of his time on the construction site, moving among the exhausted labourers, dispensing small gifts of money from his own purse, offering words of encouragement, and most powerfully leading by personal example. When a soldier faltered from exhaustion, he would look up and see his king, the master of the world, stripped to the waist, his royal shoulders caked in dust and sweat, hauling stones and timbers alongside him. It was a calculated act of psychological theatre, as much as practical leadership, a performance that transformed a grueling engineering project into a sacred personal mission for every man involved, and it was devastatingly effective in maintaining morale. At first, the work proceeded with a deceptively rapid and encouraging pace. Near the mainland shore, the water was shallow, only a few feet deep, and the sea bottom was composed of soft, accommodating mud that easily accepted the tons of rubble and earth. Piles were driven deep to create a stable foundation, and the mole grew steadily day by day, extending out from the beach like a great, accusatory finger, pointing directly at the heart of the island city. From the tops of their 150-foot walls, the Tyrian defenders watched this spectacle, with a mixture of detached amusement and profound disbelief. They were a city that had weathered the ambitions of history's greatest kings. They had seen grand armies arrive, build elaborate camps and make grand plans, and for 1,000 years they had watched them all fail. To them, this mad Macedonian was no different. Another arrogant conqueror destined to be broken against the rock of Tyre. But as the days turned into weeks, and the causeway continued to grow, their cynical amusement began to curdle into a grudging respect, and then into a genuine, creeping concern. The mole was no longer a folly, it was a tangible, growing threat. This young king was not just serious, he was obsessive. He was actually going to attempt this insane project. And, unlike Nebuchadnezzar before him, he didn't seem inclined to quit. But as the mole pushed further out into the channel, the Macedonians began to encounter the immense natural obstacles that would turn this siege from a simple construction project into a 7-month ordeal of escalating violence, death, and incredible innovation. The seafloor, which had been shallow and gentle near the coast, suddenly shelved sharply, dropping to a depth of 18 feet or more. The soft, muddy bottom gave way to harder, less forgiving bedrock, making it difficult for the foundation piles to find purchase. The sheer volume of fill material required increased exponentially. To raise the mole by 1 foot at the surface now required building a veritable mountain of rock and rubble on the seafloor below. Furthermore, every stone, every timber, now had to be transported further and further from the shore, a logistical nightmare for men working, without modern machinery. The pace of the work slowed dramatically, from yards per day to mere inches. The soldiers and labourers, who had once worked on dry fill, were now forced to toil in cold, chest-deep seawater, weighed down by their burdens, their bodies exhausted and vulnerable, and then a new, terrifying element was added to their misery. They were now within range. The Tyrians were the descendants of 1,000 years of master sailors and shrewd, pragmatic tacticians. They had defended their island home against the greatest empires on earth, and they were not about to sit passively behind their walls while a Macedonian upstart built a highway to their gates. As soon as the ever-growing causeway came within 400 paces of the island, the effective killing range of ancient artillery, they unleashed a devastatingly effective campaign of harassment that systematically turned Alexander's ambitious construction site into a blood-soaked killing ground. From the tops of their impossibly tall walls, which served as the ultimate artillery platforms, Tyrian crews began a relentless round-the-clock bombardment. These were not simple archers. They commanded the most advanced torsion catapults of the age, powerful stone-throwing engines that could hurl heavy, jagged rocks with terrifying accuracy. and bolt throwers that fired 3-foot iron-tipped arrows capable of punching through shields and armour. A constant deadly storm of projectiles rained down on the exposed and vulnerable workers labouring in the water below. Men who'd been hauling massive timbers just moments before would suddenly be impaled by a bolt they never saw coming, or crushed into the mud by a boulder dropped from 15 stories above. The shallow water at the end of the mole, once clear, now ran permanently red. The work gangs, unable to protect themselves while carrying their heavy loads, began to suffer horrific casualties. Morale plummeted as men broke and fled back towards the relative safety of the mainland. But the Tyrians did not limit their defence to long-range bombardment. They possessed a powerful and still intact fleet, the pride of Phoenicia, consisting of at least a dozen swift bronze-rammed triremes, several larger and more powerful kinkarem and quadriremes, and dozens of smaller, more nimble raiding craft. Manned by the most experienced and audacious sailors in the entire Mediterranean, these ships would dart out from Tyre's 2 well-protected harbours and attack the causeway from multiple angles. Some warships would sail in close, their decks packed with marines who would unleash a furious volley of arrows and javelins at the work parties, turning the end of the mole into a chaotic crossfire. Other ships would launch daring boarding actions, with soldiers clambering onto the timber structures to engage the startled Macedonian labourers in brutal, chaotic hand-to-hand combat, setting fire to anything that would burn before retreating back to the safety of their ships. Perhaps most insidiously, the Tyrians employed teams of expert divers. Under the cover of these attacks, these men would swim out to the mole, diving beneath the waterline to physically dislodge and remove stones from the causeway's foundation, attempting to undermine the entire structure and cause it to collapse into the sea. It was a brilliant, multi-pronged campaign of constant nerve-wracking harassment that made every single day on the causeway a waking nightmare of exhaustion and terror. Alexander's response to this deadly campaign demonstrated the terrifying adaptability and sheer force of will that made him one of history's greatest commanders. He could not yet stop the Tyrian ships, but he could and would protect his men. He gave new orders to his chief engineer, Diades. In a marvel of battlefield engineering, the Macedonians constructed 2 massive siege towers, the largest mobile structures ever built in ancient warfare up to that point. Each tower was a wooden behemoth, standing over 100 feet tall, constructed from heavy timber frames and covered with a protective layer of raw, uncured hides that had been soaked in water and vinegar to make them resistant to fire arrows. These colossal structures were mounted on massive wooden wheels and were laboriously rolled out to the very end of the causeway, the point of maximum danger. The towers were not just defensive shields, they were offensive weapon platforms. On their multiple levels, Macedonian engineers installed their own advanced torsion catapults, the petroboloi, stone throwers capable of hurling 30-pound rocks with devastating accuracy, and the oxybales, sharp shooters that could fire heavy bolts. From these new, elevated positions, Alexander's artillery crews could finally duel with the Tyrian defences on something approaching equal terms, returning fire at the city walls and, crucially, driving off the smaller raiding ships that tried to approach the mole. Protected by this new mobile artillery umbrella, the exhausted work gangs resumed their labour. Stone by stone, the causeway began to grow again. But the Tyrians were far from finished. Outdueled by the towers, they decided to destroy them in a single spectacular stroke. What they did next was an act of desperate determination and pure naval genius. their engineers took an old horse transport ship, a large, broad-beamed vessel that was considered expendable, and repurposed it into a weapon of mass destruction, a floating bomb, a fireship unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. They meticulously packed the ship's hold with the most combustible materials imaginable. Mountains of dry wood, tinder, chaff, and bales of straw, all liberally doused in pitch, sulphur, and barrels of a volatile, flammable, petroleum-based oil. They went further, constructing long yardarms that extended from the ship's mast, and from these they hung large iron cauldrons filled with more incendiary materials designed to tip over and spill their fiery contents upon impact. Finally, they heavily ballasted the stern of the ship with sand and stones, a brilliant move that would cause its bow to ride high out of the water, ensuring it would slide up onto the mole rather than glancing off. On a day when a favourable wind blew steadily from the island towards the mainland, they set their masterful plan in motion. 2 of their finest Tyrian triremes took the fireship in tow, their crews rowing with all their might to build up momentum, aiming it like a guided missile directly at the end of the causeway where Alexander's 2 proud siege towers stood. As they neared their target, the crews of the towing vessels cut the lines and veered away with practiced skill. The fireship, its momentum carrying it forward, drifted silently and inexorably toward its target. At the last possible moment, the skeleton crew aboard lit torches and set the entire vessel ablaze. They then leaped into the churning water and swam for their lives as their ship became a floating, roaring inferno. The fireship crashed into the end of the mole with results that were nothing short of apocalyptic. The massive raised bow of the ship slid perfectly up onto the timber framework of the causeway, and the entire vessel, a floating volcano of chemical fire, erupted against the base of Alexander's siege towers. The flames, fed by the wind and the volatile oils, engulfed the 100-foot-tall structures in a matter of seconds. The wet hides that were supposed to protect them were vaporized, offering no resistance to the intense pitch-fueled blaze. The carefully constructed artillery platforms, the months of painstaking work, the precious state-of-the-art siege engines, everything was consumed by the inferno. The yardarms on the mast of the fireship collapsed as planned, spilling their cauldrons of flaming oil across the causeway and creating raging rivers of fire that trapped the Macedonian soldiers. Men scrambled to escape, their screams lost in the roar of the blaze, many jumping into the sea only to be picked off by Tyrian archers. But the Tyrians had planned for this moment with chilling perfection. As the fireship did its horrific work, a fleet of their smaller vessels, their decks packed with soldiers, descended on the causeway from multiple directions. Their men poured onto the mole, engaging the shocked and disorganized Macedonians who were desperately trying to fight the fires. They systematically smashed and burned the defensive palisades, the remaining catapults, and any timber structures the fire had not yet reached. By the time they retreated back to their ships, their mission complete, the end of Alexander's causeway was a blackened, smouldering ruin. Months of back-breaking labour had been utterly undone in a single, brilliant, and devastating stroke. Alexander's magnificent siege towers, his precious siege engines, were nothing but ash and twisted metal floating on the water. The apocalyptic destruction of the causeway and the complete loss of his 2 magnificent siege towers marked, without question, the absolute lowest point of the siege for Alexander. For one of the very few times in his storied military career, he had been comprehensively and humiliatingly outmaneuvered. The Tyrians had not just defeated his engineering, they had used his own ambition against him, turning his greatest assets into a bonfire. The psychological impact on his army was immediate and severe. His soldiers, already pushed to the limits of human endurance by months of back-breaking labour, were now utterly exhausted, demoralised, and beginning to doubt the infallibility of their commander. From the tops of their walls, the Tyrians, now emboldened and ecstatic with their spectacular success, heaped scorn upon the Macedonians. They shouted taunts and insults in Greek, their voices carrying clearly across the water, sarcastically suggesting that if Alexander was truly the son of Zeus as he now claimed, perhaps he should stop playing with rocks and simply command the sea to part and walk across. Even within his own command tent the mood was turning mutinous. Some of his most senior generals, the cautious, pragmatic veterans who had served his father Philip, men like Parmenion, renewed their arguments with greater force. They insisted that the siege was hopeless, that Tyre was simply too strong, that their gods were against this venture, and that the only sane course of action was to cut their losses and move on. For any lesser commander, this confluence of catastrophic failure, plummeting morale and internal dissent, would have been the moment to admit defeat and withdraw with what little honour remained. But Alexander was not a lesser commander. The destruction of his towers didn't break his will. It reforged it into something harder, colder, and far more terrifying. He would not be beaten. He would not be mocked. If anything, the Tyrian victory had transformed this siege from a mere strategic necessity into a raw, burning, personal obsession. Tyre would fall, no matter the cost in time, treasure, or blood. In this moment of crisis, Alexander made a pivotal decision that would fundamentally change the entire character of the siege. He had tried to conquer an island from the land. Now he would conquer it from the sea. He needed ships. He needed a navy. And so he unleashed a diplomatic and political offensive that demonstrated both his growing reputation for unstoppable momentum and his shrewd understanding of regional politics. He sent urgent messages to the very Phoenician cities that Tyre had long dominated, Sidon, Byblos and Aradus, calling in the debt of loyalty they had pledged to him just months before. He did not ask. He demanded they send their entire fleets to join him at Tyre. He dispatched envoys to the kings of Cyprus, another great maritime power, who had long chafed under Persian overlordship and were now looking for an opportunity to side with the winning power. He called upon his existing allies in Rhodes. The response was a stunning testament to the new geopolitical reality he'd created at Issus. The Phoenician cities, which had been forced to contribute their best ships to the Persian fleet, had seen those vessels scattered and their crews demoralised after Darius's humiliating defeat. When Alexander conquered the coast, their sailors had simply sailed home, abandoning the Persian cause as a lost one. Now, seeing that Alexander was the undisputed rising power and eager to supplant Tyre as the centre of Phoenician trade, they eagerly pledged their fleets to him. Within weeks, a truly massive armada began assembling at the friendly port of Sidon. By the time all the allied contingents had arrived, Alexander commanded a fleet of approximately 80 Phoenician warships, another 10 from Rhodes, and a staggering 120 vessels from the kings of Cyprus. In a matter of weeks, he had gone from having virtually no naval power to commanding the largest, most powerful fleet in the entire Mediterranean, a force of nearly 220 warships. From the walls of their island fortress, the Tyrians watched this unstoppable armada assemble. A cold dread must have settled in their hearts. They were perhaps the finest sailors in the world, but even they could not fight a battle where they were now outnumbered more than 10 to 1. The rules of the siege had changed irrevocably. With his newly acquired fleet now forming an impenetrable protective screen, Alexander gave the order to rebuild the causeway. This time, however, it would be a different beast, redesigned with the hard and bitter lessons of the fireship attack in mind. The new mole would be even wider, providing more space for defensive structures and making it a less concentrated target. Its foundations were made more stable, its construction more methodical. It was now designed with two purposes in mind. First, it would still serve as his great highway to bring a new and even more terrifying generation of siege engines to the city walls. Second, it would now function as a massive breakwater, creating a calmer, more sheltered area on its southern side, where his own growing fleet could operate, safe from the strong currents and unpredictable waves that made naval operations in the Channel so difficult. Shielded from harassment, the work resumed with a grim, renewed energy. This time, when Tyrian raiding ships darted out from their harbours, they were met by squadrons of Alexander's allied vessels, who chased them off or sank them. The naval war had begun. The underwater campaign also escalated. When Tyrian divers attempted to sabotage the new foundation, they were met by Macedonian counter-divers. Brutal, silent, and desperate combats were fought in the murky depths at the base of the mole, with men stabbing at each other with daggers in a desperate unseen battle. But with the inexorable logic of superior numbers, the Macedonians prevailed. Stone by stone, timber by timber, the great causeway, now protected from both sea and land, began to grow again, a slow, unstoppable spear aimed directly at the heart of Tyre. The Tyrians could feel the iron noose tightening around their city with each passing day. From their high walls they watched in growing despair as Alexander's unstoppable causeway crept ever closer, a monstrous earthen spear aimed at their homes. On the sea, his massive fleet of over 200 warships now controlled the waters, forming a complete and suffocating blockade that cut them off from all hope of reinforcement or resupply. They knew they had to act, to gamble everything on one last desperate throw of the dice that might break the siege before it was too late. They still possessed their own fleet, now much smaller than Alexander's, but crewed by sailors who were arguably the finest and most experienced in the world. Their admirals devised a plan of such calculated audacity that it might have worked against any other, less vigilant commander. They would use deception and timing to their advantage. They observed that Alexander himself often sailed with a small squadron to the northern side of the island to oversee operations there. They also noted that at midday, the Macedonian and allied crews, believing the day's fighting was over, would often beach their ships or anchor offshore to rest and take their midday meal. The Tyrian plan was set. They would wait until Alexander was away. Then, at the precise moment of the midday lull, they would launch a sudden, overwhelming surprise attack, hoping to catch the enemy fleet unprepared, destroy or capture a significant portion of it, and regain control of the sea in a single, brilliant stroke. The plan's execution began with flawless, terrifying precision. Scouts on the walls confirmed that Alexander had indeed sailed with his personal squadron around to the northern side of the island. The midday sun was high in the sky, and the allied fleet was at rest. Inside the southern Egyptian harbour, 13 of Tyre's best and fastest warships, a mix of triremes and larger quinqueremes, had been secretly prepared. Their decks were packed with elite marines, their hulls had been reinforced, and they were crewed by their most skilled and powerful oarsmen. On a prearranged signal, the great bronze gates of the harbour's seawall swung open, and the Tyrian squadron rowed out, not in a chaotic rush, but in a disciplined, silent line of battle. Their oars moved in perfect rhythmic unison, as they charged directly at the unsuspecting Cypriot squadron that was anchored just off the southern shore. The Cypriot crews, lounging on their decks in the midday heat, had only moments to react. The Tyrians, rowing with every ounce of strength they possessed, built up a terrifying ramming speed. They crashed into the anchored Macedonian line with devastating force. The sound of splintering timber and screaming men filled the air as the heavy bronze-tipped rams of the Tyrian warships punched through the hulls of the Cypriot vessels. The attack was a spectacular success. Within minutes, the Tyrians had sunk several ships outright and had sheared the oars off several others, disabling them completely. The surviving Cypriot crews, in a state of pure panic, cut their anchor cables and desperately tried to row their damaged vessels to the mainland beach before they could be sunk. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed the Tyrians' desperate gamble had paid off, and the tide of the siege had finally turned. But their intelligence was flawed in one critical and ultimately fatal respect. Alexander was not far away. He had not gone to his main camp on the mainland. When the first sounds of the attack, the panicked shouts and the unmistakable sickening crunch of splintering wood carried across the water, he immediately and instinctively grasped what was happening. With the speed of a striking viper, he abandoned his inspection, boarded his own Unconquerable, and gave the order for every available warship he could muster to put to sea. He raced around the western side of the island at full speed, intending to cut off the Tyrian line of retreat. The Tyrian crews, still celebrating their victory and preparing to capture or burn the disabled Cypriot ships, were suddenly alerted by their scouts on the city walls. They looked up to see a horrifying sight. Alexander's fleet, led by his best Phoenician and Cypriot squadrons, appearing at the mouth of the southern harbour like an avenging storm. The Macedonian ships were fresh, their crews were battle-ready, and most importantly, they vastly outnumbered the Tyrian squadron. What followed was a brutal, close-quarters naval engagement, fought partially within the narrow confines of the harbour mouth itself. Alexander's ships, much larger than many of the Tyrian vessels, rammed them bow to bow, the preferred method of ancient naval combat. Marines from both sides exchanged storms of arrows and javelins, while grappling hooks were thrown to pull the ships together for bloody boarding actions. The battle was short, savage, and decisive. 2 of the Tyrian Quinquerames were sunk outright, their hulls shattered by the heavier Macedonian vessels. The rest, seeing they were hopelessly outnumbered and outmaneuvered, broke formation and tried to flee back into the safety of the harbour. But the harbour mouth was now a narrow, chaotic bottleneck. In their panic, several more ships were captured by Macedonian boarding parties, or were run aground by the relentlessly pursuing Allied fleet. The great Tyrian naval sortie, which had begun with such brilliant promise, had ended in catastrophic failure. Tyre's fleet, its last great trump card, had been effectively shattered. The city was now completely, utterly, and hopelessly alone. With the Great Causeway finally completed in the early summer of 332 BC, and the Tyrian navy shattered and blockaded in its harbours, the final brutal phase of the siege could begin. Alexander was at last able to bring the full, terrifying weight of his siege technology to bear on the city's massive walls. What followed was not a single quick assault, but a weeks-long systematic artillery duel of unprecedented scale and apocalyptic violence. Alexander's engineers, led by the brilliant Deides, assembled a terrifying orchestra of siege weaponry, both on the newly completed mole and, in an astonishing innovation, on specially constructed platforms built onto the decks of his largest, most stable warships. The ancient historian Arrian, drawing from the eyewitness accounts of Alexander's own generals, describes siege engines that seem to belong more to mythology than to reality. There were colossal battering rams, some over 180 feet in length, their massive bronze heads expertly shaped like a ram's head to concentrate the force of the blow. Suspended from huge timber frames by heavy chains, they were operated by crews of dozens of men who would rhythmically pull them back and then release them to crash into the walls with the force of a localized earthquake. Alongside them were the torsion catapults, the petroboloi, capable of hurling 60-pound roughly hewn boulders with enough force to shatter ancient stonework from hundreds of yards away, and the bolt-firing oxybales, giant crossbows that could send 3-foot iron-tipped projectiles with such velocity they could punch through 2 men standing in a line. Looming over all of this were the new siege towers, mobile fortresses that rivaled the city walls themselves in height, their upper levels filled with assault troops and light artillery, waiting for the moment a breach would be made. The Tyrians, now trapped and fighting for their very existence, fought back with a ferocity and desperate ingenuity that was born of having nothing left to lose. Their own powerful artillery, positioned on the tops of their walls and defensive towers, returned fire, engaging in a deadly counter-battery duel with the Macedonian siege engines. They developed a host of specialized defensive measures that showed their centuries of experience in siege warfare. In a remarkable innovation, they erected secondary wooden screens behind sections of the wall that were under the most intense bombardment. These screens would catch any stones that broke through the main wall, preventing them from causing casualties within the city streets. To counter the battering rams, they cushioned their walls by hanging huge, thick curtains made of sailcloth stuffed with seaweed, which brilliantly absorbed the kinetic impact of both the rams and the stone projectiles. Against Alexander's infantry, their tactics were even more sadistic and terrifying. They would heat sand in great bronze shields until it was scorching hot, then pour it down from the walls onto the Macedonian soldiers below. The fine, burning sand would slip between the joints of armour and against the skin, causing horrific, agonizing burns that water could not relieve. They used long poles with scythe-like hooks, called wolf claws, to grab soldiers attempting to scale the walls with ladders, hoisting them into the air and then dropping them to their deaths. They even threw massive fishing nets down onto assault troops, entangling them in groups and leaving them as helpless, struggling targets for the archers and javelin men on the walls. The defenders fought with the superhuman courage and resourcefulness of men who knew, with absolute certainty, that defeat meant the death or enslavement of every person they had ever loved. Day after agonizing day and week after bloody week, the relentless bombardment continued. The noise must have been unbearable, an endless deafening thunder of stone against stone, the sharp crack of splitting timbers, the constant high-pitched creaking of the torsion ropes on the catapults, and, underlying it all, the screams of the wounded and the dying. The mighty walls of Tyre, which had stood unbreached for a millennium, which had been considered the most formidable fortifications in the world, began to visibly crumble. Hairline cracks spread into great fissures. Entire sections of the ancient masonry began to sag and collapse under the relentless systematic pounding. Every night, under the cover of darkness, Tyrian work crews would frantically try to repair the damage, filling breaches with rubble and timber, but they were fighting a losing battle against the sheer, overwhelming destructive power that Alexander had assembled. By mid-July, after nearly 7 months of grueling siege, after a relentless cycle of innovation and counter-innovation, and after thousands of casualties on both sides, Alexander's siege engines finally accomplished what no besieger in history had ever managed. They had created a significant practicable breach in the southern wall of Tyre. The end was near. The final assault was launched in July of 332 BC, and it was a masterpiece of coordinated combined arms warfare that demonstrated Alexander's tactical mastery at its zenith. It was to be a simultaneous attack from 3 directions, designed to overwhelm the exhausted defenders. From the Great Causeway, the main assault force, led by his elite hyperspists, would storm through the breach in the southern wall. At the same moment, his main fleet, with his Phoenician and Cypriot allies, would attack both the Sidonian harbour to the north and the Egyptian harbour to the south, attempting to force entry, destroy the last of the Tyrian ships, and storm the city from the waterfront. It was an overwhelming application of force, a strategy designed to split the defenders and prevent them from concentrating their remaining strength at any single point. The horns sounded, the orders were given, and the final bloody storming of Tyre began. The first Macedonian soldiers who charged into the breach, members of the elite hyperspiced units under the command of Admetus, faced a scene from a warrior's hell. The Tyrians, knowing this was their last stand, had fortified the area behind the breach and fought with the berserker fury of the damned. The breach was contested for every single inch, a brutal close-quarters melee fought over piles of rubble and the bodies of the fallen. Admetus himself was among the first to be killed, but the Macedonians had unstoppable momentum, overwhelming numbers, and the greatest military commander of the age personally directing the assault. Alexander himself, according to the ancient sources, was not content to watch from a safe distance. He was among the first to mount one of the siege towers as it was brought to the wall, and he fought hand-to-hand on the battlements, his distinctive armour and plumed helmet making him a rallying point for his men, and a prime target for every Tyrian defender. He fought with the ferocious valour of a hero from the Iliad, inspiring his men by his presence, proving once again that he would never ask them to go where he would not lead. The final decisive breakthrough came not at the main breach, but from the sea. The Macedonian fleet, after a brutal struggle, crashed through the weakened boom defences of the harbours. The Phoenician and Cypriot ships, their decks packed with assault troops, stormed the docks and pushed into the city's commercial and residential districts. The Tyrians, now assaulted from all sides, from the great breach on the causeway, and now from within both of their harbours, could no longer maintain a coherent defence. Their lines broke. The organised resistance shattered, collapsing into thousands of desperate individual last stands fought in the narrow streets, in the marketplaces and from the rooftops. It was no longer a battle, it was a slaughter. By the time the sun began to set on that bloody July day, the Macedonian standards flew from the highest towers of Tyre. The city that had never fallen, the great and unconquerable fortress that had defied the mightiest empires of the ancient world for over a millennium, had finally and catastrophically been conquered. The fall of Tyre was absolute, and the vengeance that Alexander unleashed upon its inhabitants was biblical in its scale and horrifying in its brutality. He had lost over 400 of his own men during the grueling 7-month siege. While a relatively modest number from a purely military perspective, given the immense scale and difficulty of the operation, each death had been a personal affront to Alexander, a hardening of his already formidable heart. He'd invested 7 long months of his life, staked his military reputation, and poured every ounce of his obsessive, indomitable will into the conquest of this single, defiant city. Now, in the intoxicating, bloody flush of victory, Tyre would pay the terrible price for its defiance. The sack of the city became one of the darkest and most controversial chapters in Alexander's entire career, a moment where the already blurry lines between military necessity, strategic terrorism, and outright unrestrained atrocity dissolved into nothing. The brilliant conqueror was about to become an exterminator. Unleashed from the discipline of the siege, the Macedonian and Greek soldiers, who for 7 months had endured back-breaking labour, constant danger, daily casualties, and the galling, mocking insults of the defenders on the walls, poured through the breached city in a tidal wave of pent-up fury. This was their reward, the grim promise of ancient warfare, the right to plunder a conquered city. What followed was a frenzy of violence and looting on a horrific scale. The ancient historians, including Arrian and Curtius Rufus, record that approximately 8,000 Tyrian men, both armed combatants and unarmed civilians, were slaughtered in the final assault and the chaotic city-wide massacre that followed. The narrow ancient streets of the island fortress, once bustling with commerce, now ran with rivers of blood. Macedonian soldiers, their discipline gone, broke down doors, killing anyone who offered the slightest resistance and seizing anything of value. Great fires were set, and the magnificent centuries-old buildings that had housed the city's immense wealth were engulfed in flames. The proud, undefeated city that had stood for over 1,000 years as a beacon of commerce and culture was being systematically and apocalyptically destroyed in a single terrible day of violence. But the indiscriminate killing during the chaos of the assault was only the beginning of Tyre's agony. After the city was secured and the last pockets of resistance were extinguished, Alexander himself ordered a final, calculated act of mass execution so vast and so cruel that it shocked even the hardened veteran soldiers of his own army. Approximately 2,000 Tyrian men of military age who'd survived the initial slaughter were rounded up, bound, and marched out of the smouldering ruins of their city. By Alexander's direct command, they were all to be crucified. Ancient crucifixion was not merely a method of execution. It was a horrific instrument of public terror, designed for maximum suffering and ultimate public humiliation. The victims were nailed or tied to rough wooden crosses and left to die a slow, agonizing death from exposure, dehydration, blood loss, and eventual asphyxiation, a process that could take several days. In a final, terrible spectacle, 2,000 crosses were erected along the beaches of Tyre, a grotesque man-made forest of death, its horror visible for miles along the Phoenician coast. It was an unmistakable, unforgettable message to every other city in the Persian Empire about the terrible price of resisting the will of Alexander the Great. The grim tally was still not complete. The remaining population of the city, estimated at 30,000 people, mostly women, children, and elderly men who were deemed unfit for crucifixion, were rounded up and sold into slavery. In the great slave markets of the ancient world, entire families were separated, mothers torn from their children, husbands from their wives, never to see each other again. They were scattered across Alexander's new empire to live out the rest of their broken lives in bondage. The great city of Tyre, the ancient metropolis that had existed for over 1,000 years, that had founded the mighty colony of Carthage, and that had made kings and emperors wealthy with its legendary purple dye, was, in a matter of hours, effectively erased from the pages of history. We're almost at the incredible legacy and impact of this siege. But first, if this epic story of determination and engineering genius has captivated you, show some love by hitting that like button. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history's most dramatic moments. Now, let's see how this 7-month ordeal changed warfare forever. The Siege of Tyre stands alone in the annals of military history as one of its most remarkable and defining achievements. It was a singular testament to the almost terrifying power of human determination, boundless engineering genius, and an absolute, almost pathological refusal to accept defeat. What Alexander accomplished on that stretch of the Phoenician coast was, by every piece of conventional military wisdom of his time and for centuries after, impossible. He had successfully besieged and captured a fortified island fortress, not with a superior navy, but by building a bridge across the open sea. He had conquered a city that had never fallen in over 1,000 years of recorded history, a city that had exhausted the will of Babylonian and Assyrian kings. The psychological shockwave of this achievement on the ancient world was immeasurable. The name Tyre was synonymous with the word impregnable. If Tyre, the legendary unconquerable island fortress, could be brought to ruin by this young Macedonian, then no city was safe. No walls were high enough, no sea was wide enough, no defences were strong enough to stop him. The fall of Tyre established a new and terrible precedent. From that moment on, whenever Alexander's army approached a fortified city, the defenders had to ask themselves a soul-crushing question. If the mighty walls and open sea of Tyre couldn't stop him, how in the world could they? The sheer engineering achievement alone would have been enough to secure Alexander's place in history. The great causeway that his army built, that quarter-mile-long monument to his obsessive determination, still exists today, over 2,300 years later. It was never removed. Over the centuries that followed, the natural currents of the Mediterranean deposited sand and sediment against its massive stone foundations, widening it further, solidifying its permanence. What was once an island fortress is now a peninsula, a permanent geographical feature connecting it to the Lebanese mainland, all because of the structure Alexander's army built in 7 months of grueling, bloody labour. Modern Tyre, the city of Sour, sits on land that quite literally exists because of Alexander's siege. Today, you can walk from the mainland to the site of the ancient island city on dry land that was once 18 feet beneath the waves. It is perhaps the most tangible, lasting and incredible monument to his entire conquest, a literal reshaping of the geography of the Mediterranean through sheer force of will. But the true impact and legacy of the Siege of Tyre extend far beyond the astonishing feat of engineering. This siege demonstrated and perfected principles of warfare that would go on to influence military thinking for millennia. Alexander showed the world that victory could be achieved through a sublime combination of overwhelming determination, constant technological innovation, and, most crucially, a genius for strategic adaptability. When his first, simpler causeway was spectacularly destroyed by the Tyrian fireship, he did not abandon the plan. He rebuilt it, wider, stronger, and better protected than before. When he recognized that he lacked a navy, he did not see it as an insurmountable obstacle. He created one through shrewd diplomacy and the exploitation of regional rivalries. When conventional siege tactics from a single direction proved insufficient, he invented new ones, launching the world's first major coordinated land and sea assault from multiple directions simultaneously. The siege became the textbook example of combined arms warfare, a perfect symphony of coordinating land and naval forces, infantry and artillery, engineering and direct assault, all brought together into a single, unstoppable campaign. Military academies from the Roman era to the modern day would study the Siege of Tyre as the ultimate example of how to overcome seemingly insurmountable physical and tactical obstacles through systematic, relentless pressure and a genius for innovation. The siege also had immediate, decisive strategic consequences that directly shaped the remainder of Alexander's campaign. With Tyre fallen and the entire Phoenician coast now firmly under his control, the great Persian fleet was effectively and permanently neutralized. Its most important naval base was gone. The ships of its most skilled sailors, the Phoenicians, were now fighting for Alexander, not against him. The remaining Persian vessels scattered across the Aegean now had nowhere to resupply, nowhere to make repairs, and nowhere to recruit new crews. The great Persian naval threat that had so haunted Alexander's strategic planning simply evaporated without a single major fleet-on-fleet battle. His vulnerable supply lines, stretching all the way back to Macedonia and Greece, were now secure. He could now march into Egypt and then onwards into the heart of Persia without any fear of Persian fleets landing armies in his rear. The 7 brutal months invested in conquering Tyre paid strategic dividends that would last for the rest of his life. Without the security that the fall of Tyre provided, there would have been no peaceful conquest of Egypt, no divine proclamation at the Siwa oasis, no founding of his greatest city, Alexandria, and likely no final decisive confrontation with Darius at Gaugamela. The causeway that Alexander built didn't just connect the mainland to an island, it connected his victory at Issus to his ultimate conquest of the Persian Empire. This siege also marked a clear and troubling turning point in Alexander's character, a psychological shift that historians still debate with great passion. The almost inhuman brutality of the aftermath, the mass crucifixions and the enslavement of an entire population, revealed a darker, more ruthless side to his nature. Some historians argue that this was a calculated and pragmatic act of state terror, a horrific but necessary message sent to other cities that the cost of resistance would be annihilation, thus saving lives in the long run by encouraging widespread surrender. Others see it as evidence of a deep and dangerous character flaw, an inability to forgive defiance, a narcissistic rage that would become more pronounced as his power grew and his belief in his own divinity solidified. Whatever the truth, Tyre marked the moment when Alexander's reputation shifted from that of a brilliant, audacious general to something more complex, more absolute, and far more terrifying, a force of nature like an earthquake or a hurricane that could not be stopped, only survived. Finally, the fall of Tyre had profound and permanent implications for the balance of power in the ancient world. The great Phoenician cities, which had been the dominant players in Mediterranean commerce and naval warfare for centuries, never recovered their independence or their former glory. Their fleets, which had once been the source of their power, were now absorbed into Alexander's forces and later, those of his successor kingdoms. They became mere tools of Greek imperial power rather than independent forces shaping their own destiny. The vast and profitable trading networks that the Phoenicians had painstakingly established over a millennium were co-opted and absorbed into the new, dynamic, Hellenistic world that Alexander was creating in his wake. Tyre itself would eventually be rebuilt, its location too strategic to be abandoned, but it would be as a Greek city, a part of a larger empire, never again as the proud, independent maritime superpower it had once been. The age of Phoenician supremacy on the seas was over, decisively and brutally replaced by the new Hellenistic kingdoms that would dominate the Mediterranean for the next 300 years. The Siege of Tyre represents one of the most audacious and defining military campaigns in all of human history. It was a 7-month epic of innovation, brutality, and sheer, indomitable will, where one man's absolute refusal to accept the impossible literally and permanently reshaped reality itself. Alexander the Great didn't just conquer a city, he conquered the ocean that protected it. He built a bridge where no bridge should exist and proved, in the most dramatic way imaginable, that to a mind like his there are no truly insurmountable obstacles, only complex problems awaiting unconventional solutions. It was a siege that demonstrated the supreme, terrifying power of a singular human will, combined with brilliant engineering and tactical genius to overcome geography, tradition, and all conventional wisdom. It was not just a victory, it was a statement about the nature of power itself. What makes this story so compelling and so resonant even millennia later is the sheer, almost inhuman scale of the ambition involved. When his most experienced engineers told him it couldn't be done, when his veteran generals begged him to move on, when the Tyrians themselves mocked him from their supposedly impregnable walls, he didn't waver, he didn't compromise, he doubled down. With a resolve that bordered on the fanatical, he transformed a catastrophic military defeat, the destruction of his first towers, into an unshakable determination. He turned his frustration into radical innovation, pivoting from a land-based assault to a combined land and sea operation on a scale the world had never seen. The moment the fireship destroyed his siege towers could have been the end. For almost any other commander in history, it would have been a clear sign from the gods to abandon the attempt. But for Alexander, it was merely a temporary setback, a tactical problem to be solved with even greater force, even greater cleverness, and an even greater expenditure of will and resources. The causeway that Alexander built, the Mole of Tyre, stands today as the ultimate enduring monument to his unique and terrifying character. It wasn't the largest battle he ever fought, nor was it his most brilliant tactical victory in the open field, but it was perhaps the purest and most revealing expression of who he was as a commander and as a man. He was a force of nature who would literally wage war against the sea itself, who would move mountains of stone and reshape coastlines, who would sacrifice 7 months of his campaign, untold resources, and the lives of hundreds of his own men, all for a single defiant island. He did it because he had declared it must be done, and his will was not to be denied by man, by nature, or by the gods themselves. That causeway, still visible today connecting the ancient island to the mainland, is a structure that has outlasted the empires, the religions, and the civilizations that followed. It is one of the very few things Alexander built that still physically exists, a permanent testament in stone and earth to what one determined human being can accomplish when they refuse to be told what is possible. But the story of Tyre also carries a darker, more profound lesson, a moral complexity that complicates our admiration for Alexander's towering achievement. The brutal, almost nihilistic aftermath, the mass crucifixions, the enslavement of an entire population, the utter destruction of a city that had stood for over 1,000 years. These acts serve as a chilling reminder that even the most impressive and heroic military victories almost always come with a terrible and often unforgivable human cost. The 2,000 men who were crucified on the beaches were not abstract casualties of war. They were fathers and sons, husbands and brothers, who died in one of the most agonizing ways imaginable. The 30,000 people, mostly women and children who were sold into slavery, had their lives, their families, and their futures stolen from them simply because they had the profound misfortune to live in a city that chose to stand in the path of Alexander's ambition. History remembers, and rightly so, Alexander the Great, the brilliant conqueror. It rarely, if ever, remembers the names of the Tyrians who died defending their homes. Ultimately, the Siege of Tyre indisputably changed the course of history in ways that echo down to the present day. Strategically, it secured Alexander's conquest of the entire eastern Mediterranean, paving the way for his ultimate victory over Persia and the subsequent creation of the vast culture-fusing Hellenistic world. Militarily, it demonstrated engineering techniques and combined arms siege warfare innovations that would be studied and copied for centuries, influencing commanders from Julius Caesar to the military engineers of the Renaissance. Geographically, it created a permanent land bridge that still exists, a literal and lasting scar on the face of the planet. And psychologically, it cemented Alexander's reputation as a commander who could not be stopped, a man who would and could achieve the impossible through the sheer force of his will. For 7 months, the fate of the world was decided on a beach in Phoenicia, as one man built a bridge to an island. After it was done, nothing would ever be the same. What do you think about Alexander's decision to spend 7 months besieging Tyre instead of bypassing it? Was it a cold, calculated, strategic necessity that secured his entire campaign? Or was it an obsessive quest for personal glory, a vendetta that wasted valuable time and resources? And what about the brutal aftermath? Was it a calculated act of psychological warfare that, by encouraging other cities to surrender, ultimately saved lives in the long run? Or was it an inexcusable war crime that reveals a dark, tyrannical streak in Alexander's character? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing different perspectives on these complex and fascinating historical questions. And if this incredible story of the impossible siege that changed history captivated you, please make sure to subscribe for more epic tales from the ancient world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest historical deep dives, where we bring the drama, the strategy, and the unforgettable human stories of history's most pivotal moments to life. We'll see you in the next video, where history comes alive,